Today we're talking about blue cards, and we're just going to go over each of them in turn, talk about what they do, whether or not they're good in draft or ranked, and like what kind of decks they fit into. To start with, we always start with the monuments because they are the one no-cost card. Cobalt Monument is a 3/3 Storm Dancer with flying that costs 5, and when you do not have 5 power, it is a power that is depleted. So when you play it, you don't get the power immediately, but you get it on your next turn. Most of these monuments are always good choices in mono decks, mono-colored decks, where you just have the one color and you're not looking to get to 8 power. Unfortunately, that doesn't leave a lot of places for Cobalt Monument because there's some really good 8 power cards in blue that really like you to dive deep. So the control matchup for Cobalt Monument is a little bit weaker, but I think this card is very strong, and it often sees play in flight school decks. If you're trying to make a deck that has just a huge density of flying units, then taking like 4 of your power and turning them into flying units tends to make that really, really good. And that's the same thing about all of the other ones. These actually like increase your creature density while still allowing you to play power until you get up to the right amount. So they work very well in aggressive flying decks. This card is quite good in draft. A 3/3 flyer is a good enough body to be fairly annoying. It's got a good clock on it. By that I mean that it will always put your opponent on a clock, basically to whether or not they're going to die. So if you play this card out, you're going to be putting pressure on your opponent, and it's just slightly difficult to kill. It still dies to Torch, which is always a little sad, but the stats on it are pretty good for a flyer. It being a power gives it a nice bit of versatility in draft. So yeah, both good in draft and standard. Not a particularly standout card in either. Shamanic Trance, reduce the cost of a spell in your hand by 1. This card is not particularly good, but it has some unusual uses in standard. It is absolutely do not pick in draft. There's no reason to run Shamanic Trance in draft. Maybe if you had like 3 or 4 Channel the Tempests and your deck was all blue somehow. Yeah, but there aren't really that many good reasons to do this. So this card obviously like exchanges tempo for card advantage, and it does so in a way that is like extremely risky, because you are spending a card to reduce the cost of a spell in your hand by just 1. And while getting some of those big power spells like Channel the Tempest or Dimensional Rift out really early can be quite okay, and like if you do that with a Shamanic Trance and a Channel the Tempest, and you get those 3 cards back, that's not bad. This is still like so risky that it's not really used, and obviously you just don't want that kind of disadvantage. This card is weaker than Excavate in terms of the card disadvantage that it gives. The effect is not all that great. It works okay with Northwind Herald, so if you're playing a deck that wants to play both a lot of fast spells and a lot of heralds, then you can run it. But by and large, this is one of the worst cards in the game. And while it has the potential to be just like this really strong combo card, I'm not sure it's there yet. But maybe a standard deck will find a place for it someday. Blind Storyteller. 1 for a 0/1. If you pay 2 and exhaust Blind Storyteller, you get to draw a card and discard a card. An interesting thing about this is that cards that have these kind of abilities, these you activate them abilities, they activate the turn that you play them. So if you play Blind Storyteller on 3, you will get the draw discard effect no matter what. There is no way to respond to that in a fast spell format, because fast spells don't activate until the ability activates. You are allowed to play creatures and put weapons on them and activate their abilities, and none of those things will be prevented by fast spells. So that makes these kind of cards a little bit stronger in that particular aspect. Blind Storyteller is a pretty strong card. It applies some disadvantage. Yeah, Killer is also an effect that happens where when you play it, you get to at least declare the attack before fast spells happen. You can get that creature killed or silenced in response to the fast spell happening, but it will still be attacking. So, yeah. Blind Storyteller really likes to cycle through your deck and get interesting cards. Having one on the ground is actually quite beneficial, and people are generally obligated to kill it, so it doesn't provide disadvantage in that particular sense. It often trades 1 card for 1 the way it's supposed to. But if you just ignore it, then it's not actually doing you any good apart from just sort of standing there and maybe being a blocker later on, because it doesn't actually block. You have to exhaust it to draw the card and discard a card. This card sees a lot of standard play in a deck that runs resurrection units, and the reason for that is, of course, you just toss something really, really good into your void, and then you resurrect it on turn 5, and that works out very well. So Blind Storyteller is a pretty standard staple for some low-tier decks that really like resurrection engines, and those decks are going to get better over time because there's going to be a bigger stable of creatures to choose from, a stable of units to choose from. It's a little weak in draft because it does apply that aforementioned card disadvantage where you are playing a card out and then you're not actually drawing any cards or anything like that, and it's also not affecting the board in any meaningful fashion, but the cycle is still useful, so you can run it in draft if you are running the right cards with it. Chill, stun an enemy unit. I think this is a set 0 card. Costs 1. The effect is pretty weak. It's better than Daze, which is the colorless version of this. But by and large, it's not a very strong effect at all. The stun effect is actually like mildly reasonable now, and it does last for 2 turns. Prevents a creature from blocking for 2 turns in addition to exhausting the unit on the turn that you play it, right? So you can play cards like these. Flash Freeze is obviously the better option, but if you're looking for something in the cheap range, then this one's okay. I can see it in standard with Icebreakers, which is a card that kills stunned units. Otherwise, it's just providing way too much disadvantage for what it's asking. And as a result, it also wouldn't be a very strong card in draft unless you have somehow managed to craft a really aggressive shell that's also in blue. And that's pretty rough. Blue is not a color that really likes to attack. I guess we didn't really do like the color explanation here. So blue really likes to do a lot of tricksy things. They like infiltrate, they like flyers. Blue cards tend to be pretty poorly statted, but have a lot of abilities on them and a lot of like really powerful effects. Blue cards really like spells. Blue cards like casting spells. Blue cards like doing things at instant speed. They like sort of like running the control archetype, where your units are pretty hard to kill, and then everything that you do just kind of interferes with your opponent or messes with them in some way. They have Fate as one of their keyboard abilities, so you will see a lot of Fate and Echo cards in blue. They also like to stun units, and stunning is a pretty powerful archetype as well. So blue is sort of like the tricksy, and really kind of a fun type of color for people who want to do that. Anyways, moving back to the card explanations. Levitate. Oh, Cloud Snake Hatchling, actually. 1/2 flying for 1. This card is not super strong, but it is an okay flying creature. You can stick swords on it, and that makes it pretty beneficial. Like, it's one of the best statted flyers it is the best statted flyer at 1. Apart from Twilight Raptor, which is a hybrid, and therefore usually ends up as a 2-drop. So, yeah, it's decent to stick stuff on, especially Cloud Snake Saddle, because what else are you going to stick it on? I have just seen someone trying this in Master, actually. But in general, this card doesn't have a big enough effect on the board to be really particularly relevant, and blue cards don't usually run rush strategies. Yeah, so since there aren't a lot of like rush strategies here, Cloud Snake Hatchling tends to fall a little by the wayside. But being a cheap flyer has its own benefits, and as a result, it can see play in standard. I wouldn't really pick it in draft, but having a flyer is just okay. If you have enough swords to stick it on, then this is an option. It'd be better to try and get something on a 2 or 3 drop in draft. Levitate. Give a unit flying this turn, draw a card. This card is very powerful, actually. In Magic, you call it a cantrip, meaning it pays for itself, or rather, you draw a card in addition to playing the card, so you never actually incur card disadvantage by playing this card. All it does is slow your deck down a little bit. The thing about Levitate is that while the Levitate effect is actually decently strong sometimes, because there are a couple of creatures that you only need to have flying for 1 turn, namely anything with Infiltrate, anything with Deadly, or like anything else where it's just like, you just need it for a block, you just need it to get through the opponent's line 1 time. Levitate, like, serves that purpose. Levitate also works kind of funnily with Violent Gust, which is a 2-cost card that deals a bunch of damage to a flying unit. We'll get to that in a second. The thing about this card, however, that really makes it interesting is that this game has a meta around Aegises, or it has a lot of cards that have Aegis. And Aegis is something that people have problems dealing with sometimes. And if you are in a control archetype where you're always trying to like control the board and make sure that these creatures are like, you know, not making your life miserable, then you need a way to get rid of those Aegises before you play your more powerful spells. And Levitate is that card. It makes a great sideboard against Aegis, and I think that's a place where it really belongs. You can run it in draft. I think it's pretty strong in draft, especially if you are running infiltrate units and you've managed to draft in blue and purple. If you draft in blue and purple, then this card is really quite nice. And in general, like, you know, it just cycles through your deck, so that's not too bad. It's almost never going to be too disadvantageous. It doesn't see too much play in Standard, but it does see play in Standard. And yeah, it's just a nice little Swiss Army knife that you have at 1. Fairly useful card. Permafrost. Stun the cursed unit for as long as it's cursed. People who are new to the game hate this card. They think it is way too powerful. I often do not run it, but it is a good card to have in Standard, and it's a good removal spell for you. So this is a curse, which means that it attaches to an enemy unit. And as long as the enemy unit has this permafrost on them, then it's not going to attack or block. But as soon as the permafrost pops off, so does the stun effect. So it's not like a regular stun effect where, yeah. Yeah, no, it is low-costed. This is entirely true. A slow removal card, but it does get rid of something pretty easily. The thing that it doesn't do is get rid of creatures with endurance. And if you are seeing a lot of permafrost and a lot of stun effects, you can run a card called Infinite Hourglass, and very easily just neutralize every permafrost in the game, because Infinite Hourglass gives every creature endurance. This is conditional removal, and its main conditions are the creature has to not have an ability that affects you when it's not attacking or blocking. So it can't be something like Explorer Emeritus, where it's drawing a card every turn, or Sandstorm Titan, where it's... well, Sandstorm Titan can't be permafrosted anyways, but like basically it can't have some ability that's going to affect you. It also can't have endurance, and it can't get endurance later. And that's the thing about permafrost that really sucks, is that sometimes you put a permafrost on something and then they play like Deep Forged Plate on it, or the cheaper option is Stalwart Shield. And either of those things gives the unit endurance, which just causes the permafrost to fall off. As soon as a creature gets endurance, permafrost falls off, and regardless of whether or not you silence that creature, it's never going to be stunned again. Or unless you play another permafrost. So there's some unique card disadvantage to this removal, and there's some unique ways that this removal can lose you a game. But it's still a very strong effect, it's got a very cheap cost, and that makes it very, very solid in both draft and standard. I highly recommend it. Unstable Form. Man, this is one of my favorite designs in the set. Transform a unit into a random unit that costs 1 or more. This card has Echo, so you always get 2 of them. Whenever you draw it, you get an extra copy. So like if you figure out some way to put it on top of your deck, then you get more free copies, and that's good stuff. Unstable Form is really, really fun. It's good enough to see play in some standard decks. So it does have some like Swiss Army knife capabilities where if you're dealing with a creature that you just can't deal with, like it's just like completely out of your wheelhouse and it's clearly going to like combo with something. I think the big example is Gorgon Infiltrator, which many people build decks around because Gorgon Infiltrator can get flying and they can bring it back from their graveyard. You know, so if you have like a Gorgon Infiltrator that you're just staring down and you're like, I can't remove this right now. I know that my opponent has like a billion ways to get it into my face, and once that happens, he draws 3 cards. I don't like this at all. I'm just going to turn this into a 4/4, and then I can kill that card. So that's something that Unstable Form has use for as an offensive maneuver. The other thing it's okay at is popping Aegises, because you spend half a card to pop an Aegis. So that's pretty decent as well. In addition, of course, it's quite good at buffing your own units, and it's quite good at creating like really weird surprises. If you do this on like a 6-cost unit, especially like kind of a cheap body that's done something already, like say Lumen Shepherd, which is a card that generates little 1/1s, but you play it down and it's just kind of a boring 4/6, then you can create like really, really good cards like the 8-cost Scions. Unstable form can really do a lot of valuable things that way. In addition, like there are actually like very few cards at 9 and 10, so it's pretty easy to get a reliable 9 or 10 card by morphing an 8-cost card. The 10-cost slot currently has Skycrag Wyvark in it, which is a 5/5 flying, and that's merely okay. But the other 10-cost card is a 8/8 that prevents the enemy from casting spells called Scourge of Frostholm, and so Unstable Form has like some real impacts there. There's only one card at 9 right now. That may change. That's Lava Blood Goliath. If you can figure out a way to use Lava Blood Goliath, then you can always reliably get a Lava Blood Goliath by morphing a 7-cost. And then like there are just a lot of dangerous cards that are more expensive that are pretty good. The card that I think Unstable Form combos the most with is a card called Northwind Herald that is free if you have played 2 spells this turn. So you can figure out a way to play it out for free, like very early on, and then turn it into a 7 or 8-cost card. That's pretty good, because it stops being free after you're done with the board. There's a lot of interesting application for this card. It's a good, strong standard card. It's actually quite okay in draft, because it upgrades your creature in a way that's similar to a weapon, and it still pops Aegises. It still has like just so many different applications. This is a hard card to use, though. It does run the risk of just blowing you out if you use it offensively, or doing something poor for you if you use it defensively. You can turn a card, for example, into an Idol of Destran, which is a 0/0 creature that dies instantly. Yeah, you know, so many foibles and drawbacks, but overall, currently a pretty reliable card. This is a card that's going to get worse as more sets release, because that random unit is just going to become more and more random, and that's going to be worse and worse. Yeti Spy, 1/1 infiltrate draw card. This card's merely okay. It's definitely not like a strong pick in draft, but if you get it and you get the draw card, then you have a little bit of advantage there, and that's always nice. I don't think it has a place in standard right now. The stats are too weak. It's pretty easy to kill with like half a card, and then you don't get any advantage out of it at all. It's not like a card that you want to draw into later in the game, so that makes it pretty weak in that respect. There are better infiltrate effects that you want to do like more things with, but Yeti Spy can be like kind of okay. The only deck that really loves Yeti Spy is the Gauntlet deck that gets infinite infiltrates, and then it's just like, hey, yeah, now I can draw all the cards I want. Yeti Spy is merely meh. You can pick it in draft if you need a 1-drop to stick something on, or if you need just low drops in general, and it will generate some advantage. Backlash! Negate an enemy spell and deal 2 damage to that player. This is one of the only counters in the game right now, and it is extremely strong. The cost can be mildly prohibitive, but not too bad. The 2 damage is pretty relevant sometimes, and can often like mean the difference between life and death. So it's a good card to play, like even in aggressive decks. I use it in my Elysian midrange deck. I haven't seen that many other people running Backlashes in Elysian midrange, but I think they're wrong. Just being able to protect your creatures is pretty relevant sometimes. Yeah, this card does what it says on the tin. It's a really good surprise. It prevents a lot of bad things from happening to you in spell format, and there's almost always a good target for it, so it's a decent card to run. It works well in control matchups. It works pretty good in like mid-range matchups. It's probably not that good in aggressive matchups, but you will probably have the power free for it at some point. I recommend picking it in draft, but fairly late. It's not highly picked in draft. It's more of a late pick than an early pick. Cloudsnake Saddle, +3/+3, can only be played on a unit with flying. This card is quite good in draft because it's a very powerful equipment that's very cheap. If you have like things like Cloudsnake Hatchlings, then Cloudsnake Saddle becomes very disgusting. It's quite good on Eastwind Herald, which is the card right to the right of it. This card is decently strong. I think it has some play in standard. The cost is okay. The restriction is fair. The amount of stats that it provides for the cost is really quite bonkers, but it doesn't provide any like extra advantage, so if your opponents are playing enough removal, then you're kind of out of luck. I think that this card has a place in standard decks. It's not super strong at the moment, but it is a very good card in terms of like aggressive flyers, and I'm sure we'll see more of it. Eastwind Herald, flying 1/3, summon reduce the cost of the top spell of your deck by 1. This card is actually a very good 2-drop. It protects from aggression. It's pretty hard to kill. The 1 damage like basically just means that it blocks all of the weenies in the world. I actually think it's a good card in draft for exactly that reason. It's good at blocking 2/2s as well, so it keeps you safe from a lot of stuff that it wouldn't otherwise do. And the summon effect is pretty relevant. In addition, since it's got like a decent amount of health, it's good to equip stuff on. Any type of like buff or spell that goes on it makes it pretty decent. The stats are just okay in general. The reduced cost is usually pretty handy, can be helpful for things like Backlash, where it just like reduces the cost of your combat trick. I think this card is just good all around. It's a solid pick in draft, it's a solid pick in standard. Island's Favor. You get an Aegis, draw a Primal Sigil from your deck. This card is one of the least used favors, but it is a very solid sideboard card because every once in a while you just want Aegises. This is an Aegis for you personally. There are not that many spells that target you personally, and some of them have like very, very nasty effects. I think the most common are Burnout, Pyroblast, Sabotage, Rain of Frogs. Like, there are a lot of things that can just blow you out if you don't have an Aegis, and Island's Favor is a way to stop that. In addition, it fixes your mana, or fixes your power. That's pretty strong. Yeah, this card doesn't get used as much as maybe it even should be used, but it's also not used right now because it is probably the weakest of the favors. I'd certainly stick it in a sideboard, depending on what the meta was and what you expect to see in a tournament. Herald's Song. Draw a card, then discard a card. This card has Echo. So, like, there's kind of a unique deal with Herald's Song, where if you draw a card, you can discard the other Herald's Song, and you don't actually lose any card disadvantage. But if you use both Herald's Songs, then you do. It's also kind of expensive. Right now, this card is not seeing a lot of play in Standard, but it does see play in the same deck that the Blind Storyteller sees play, because, yeah, it is quite good in that particular respect. If you figure out a way to make it cheap, you can cycle through a lot of your cards very fast. It's an okay card, and it has a play in Standard. I don't think you should play it in Draft, really, because it's a little too slow. But, I don't know, you could probably give it a shot if you just had nothing else to fill with. It does not provide any actual card advantage unless you figure out a way to make the Echo work, in which case you can get an extra card out of it. This card has some strong combo potential, but isn't a draft pick, and isn't a strong standard card at the moment. Lightning Storm, 2 damage to each unit, for 2. Yeah, this card's very good, and most blue decks want to run 4 of them. This just makes aggro decks very, very, very angry. It is as good as a harsh rule for a lot of aggro decks. It's a good way to just wipe out the board and make sure that you aren't getting completely destroyed by small, fast, tiny creatures. In addition, it's okay for like turning bad trades into good ones. There are just like a lot of good options there that work out pretty well. Lightning Strike, deal 4 damage to an attacking enemy. This card is another good removal spell that is decent for just dealing with certain creatures. It shifts in and out of the meta. Depends really on what it is you're facing down. Lightning Strike, 4 damage to an attacking enemy. This card is quite okay. It's good in Draft in particular. It's a very strong removal spell in that particular format. It's a decent removal spell in other formats, and the other thing it's actually pretty good at is making Relic Weapon decks cry. Because a lot of times Relic Weapon decks will try to swing in on you, and you Lightning Strike them, and it destroys their Relic Weapon, and they're very unhappy. And, you know, like, empty boards, yeah, this card is quite decent at protecting your own creatures in some ways. Yeah, it has a lot of versatility. It tends to be just about exactly average, but it's worth putting into quite a few decks if you're trying to be defensive, and it's a good control card. And a very good draft card. New Stranger, 1/1 Echo. This is not a very good Stranger, but he has some plays. I wouldn't really pick him in Draft unless you are really into Strangers. I wouldn't really pick him in Standard unless you're also really into Strangers. I think this card has a lot of potential, and as usual with Strangers, like, we're just sort of waiting to see if there's going to be like a big Stranger boost of some kind, or what the Strangers in the next set are going to be like, and then I think this card will be much better. Yeah, you can create a lot of fairly cheap Strangers that are 1/1s and are going to have a lot of abilities. If you can get this and like a lot of like second sights and other stuff, so you can just make a bunch of these guys, The control idea here is that you run Fortunate Stranger and draw cards with every one that you play. Yeah, there's some interesting potential combos with this card. Right now it's pretty weak, but it does give you 2 creatures for the price of 1, and that alone in Echo, like, Echo makes a decent keyword just for that alone. This is probably the weakest Echo card at the moment, and maybe someday it will not be. Second Sight, draw 2 cards, put a card from your hand on top of your deck. I think we've talked about this card a lot already, just in context of like talking about Echo cards, because yeah, this card works with Echo cards really well. By itself, it's a decent way to sort of like get a handle on what's on top of your deck and get access to cards that you wouldn't have access to either way. It doesn't provide actual card advantage, but if you are using Echo, it does, and that's something that's really quite relevant. So this card is very good because it's one of the few cards that can actually put cards from your hand on top of your deck. And Echo cards exist, and they're very meaningful. So Second Sight makes 3 Strangers, it makes 3 Herald Songs. It makes for a lot of really interesting things. It's quite good with Static Bolt, which is the next card that we're going to talk about. Static Bolt, deal 1 damage. Fate, increase the damage of all Static Bolts in your hand and deck by 1. So this card activates when you draw it, and it always deals 2 damage. It is never a card that deals just 1. So 2 power for 2 damage is pretty decent. It's a good card in draft for exactly that reason. If you get one early, and then you get another one, and then you get another one and another one, then this card just becomes completely bonkers insane. If you can give this card Fate with Elysian Trailblazer, it's a basic win condition. Like, the amount of damage that this thing can get up to is pretty nuts. I ran an archetype called Carpet Shuffle, which the idea was just you shuffled around on the carpet until you had enough Static Bolts to kill your opponent. And that usually ends up like blowing out with a Static Bolt for 7, a Static Bolt for 8, and a Static Bolt for 9. And it's just like, well, that's all of your health. I hope you enjoyed that particular time. Yeah, this card's decent removal. It's not like super strong in Standard because you've got other options, but if you have a lot of ways to put it back on top and make it stronger, then it's actually going to get much better for you. It works well with Excavate, Second Sight, anything that does Echo. Yeah, there's a lot of cool things that this card can do. And it's just a really fun and great design. What a fun spell. Tundra Explorer. When this attacks, if the top card of your deck is a spell, draw it. This card has a lot of potential standard options. It's okay in draft. Yeah, so this thing can generate a ton of card advantage if it's unanswered. And if you're playing a lot of spells, there's a lot of good ways to make sure that it is unanswered, so that alone makes Tundra Explorer kind of neat. The disadvantage to it, of course, is that it can be killed pretty easily. If you get this piercing shotted, then it didn't really do much, and a 2/3 might have been better. This card can be played in Standard, it can be played in Draft. It's not particularly good in either unless you have a spell focus. In Draft, I think it's a pretty strong idea. Just in general, this one has such a good chance to draw you a card if you are playing a good amount of removal spells that it can be really beneficial in that particular respect. The stats aren't great, but they're close enough to great to be good in draft. Violent Gust, deal 5 damage to a flying unit. So this card works really well with Levitate, I think I mentioned before, and you can just skeet shoot things by giving them flying and then dealing 5 damage to them. The 5 damage is super relevant, kills almost all flyers. That makes it a fairly strong removal card. I think this card has seen some play in Standard, but isn't currently in the meta. But in general, like, it's not bad at all. If you're running it in Standard, you have to run it with Levitates or Cobalt Acolytes, because otherwise you'll run into some decks where you just can't use it at all. And if you're running both Levitates and Cobalt Acolytes, this should be like an auto-include. Yeah. The weakness is pretty obvious, like it doesn't kill things that aren't flying, so if your opponent has no flying units, then you're just the saddest panda. But it's a good card in draft because flyers are fairly common and really need to be removed, and it's a good card in Standard. Don't run too many of them in draft because you will basically just be faced with some situations where you can't use them at all. Whispering Wind, 1/2, flying. When it attacks, you may discard a card to draw a higher cost card from your deck. Strong in that reanimation deck where you discard a lot of cards. strong in general. Like, the stats on it are a little bit iffy, but this is a card that you actually kind of have to kill, because it's very good at, like, just cherry-picking the best cards out of an opponent's deck. And, yeah, if a person who is continually attacking with Whispering Wind will have a hand of cards that he really likes, versus a hand of card that he really doesn't. So, yeah, Whispering Wind is quite strong in Standard. I think it's bad in Draft. It's a flyer. It gets some stuff, like, but yeah, you kind of want your cheaper cost cards in Draft, so it's a pretty low pick on my end. I would say that there are better 2-drops, Wild Cloud Snake being one of them. Wild Cloud Snake is a 1/1 flyer. When you play another unit with flying, Wild Cloud Snake gets +1/+1. This is a tiny flyer that has to be answered, and that alone makes it very good. It sees play in Standard in decks that use a lot of flyers. It sees play in Draft because, for exactly the same reason. This card can get up to be like a 5/5 or a 6/6 for 2, and it's got flying. That's a really good combination of stats. This card is really tricky and nasty. If you can keep it protected for long enough, then it's quite good. It can get killed easily, of course, but in general, it's a good pick in either case. Yeti Snowslinger, 2/2, infiltrate, draw a snowball. Snowballs are surprisingly relevant, do not discount them. They will always do something useful. Sometimes it's killing a small creature, sometimes it's killing a big creature, sometimes it's killing a 3/1, sometimes it's just like, doing that last point of lethal. Yeti Snowslinger is pretty likely to get his snowball since he's a fairly fast creature. His infiltrate effect isn't as strong as some other infiltrate effects that exist, like the Lethrai Rangers, but it's still strong enough to pick it in Draft. I don't think this card seems to play in Standard. Snowballs are useful, but there are better ways to get them in Standard. Cobalt Acolyte, give a unit flying. This creature will give you good infiltrates, and he will also do a couple of other interesting things for you. It's very good in Draft because, amongst other things, if you summon it, it can give itself flying, and that means you have a 2/1 flyer for 3. That's not really a bad combination of stats in Draft. It has some options in Standard, but won't see that many. The ranked options are okay. I ran this card for a little bit with Joral Iceheart, which is a 6/6 infiltrate. Basically, it's just okay at doing the same thing that Levitate does, while also being on a body. Whether you pick this or Levitate depends on whether you want to develop a board or control the board. Cobalt Acolyte is a decent amount of board development, pops Aegises, gives big creatures flying, has a lot of versatility, and isn't really that badly costed for that type of card. It's a card I would recommend in Standard that doesn't have a place in any decks at the moment. Eye of Winter, 3. Once per turn you may pay 2 to stun a unit. This card is a very strong relic that is going to require you to have a very slow strategy. This is the obvious control card. It's very annoying in a deck that people are currently calling Camel-less control. And yeah, it just keeps one unit stunned for a very long period of time. Due to the new stun rules, it's actually quite ridiculous because having a unit stunned prevents it from blocking for 2 turns, so Eye of Winter can actually maybe even see some play in mid-range decks. It's a very good card in Standard. In Draft, it's a little bit slow, but it's still going to be shutting down units and having a very powerful effect on the board. The power cost is a drain that is not necessarily going to be advantageous for you, but it gives you some versatility, and it's pretty consistent, and it's fairly hard to get rid of, which is fairly important. Most relics are pretty hard to get rid of. So in Draft, it's okay. In Standard, it's quite strong. Just run it in Control. Flash Freeze, stun 2 enemy units. This card is actually pretty strong in Draft. It's just good enough to get across damage and prevent blockers. The advantage it provides is like sort of temporary removal, but it's still 2-for-1 removal, and as such, it can be really quite good. I think it even sees play in a couple of Standard decks, but not too many. If you are running an aggressive strategy, Flash Freeze is quite good. If you're running a defensive strategy, it's card disadvantage, but it still is pretty good at preventing things from killing you. Won't see that much play in Ranked, but definitely a good pick in Draft if you are running the right cards for it. Ice Sprite, 1/2 flying, stun an enemy unit when you summon it, and then Ice Sprite continues to stun it, similar to a Permafrost. Yeah, this is a fun card. It's good in any deck that has synergy with flyers, like a Wild Cloud Snake deck. The stun effect is quite powerful, but obviously It's vulnerable to removal, and removal is very bad for you because it both disables the stun effect and kills the sprite. You can suit these up, and that makes them quite okay. I think they're pretty strong pick in draft. Their stats aren't great, they don't attack too well, but they're really obnoxious, and they're a fun card to play. A good card in early control decks. Hasn't seen a lot of play in ranked recently. Icebreaker, 0-3, exhaust this to kill a stunned enemy unit. Oh my gosh, this is so good. So this is a fun combo card. We've just discussed 3 cards in a row that are really good with it. Flash Freeze in particular is just 2-for-1 card advantage with this card, because if you stun 2 enemy units, Icebreaker gets to first off kill the stunned enemy unit from the first time, and the next turn that other unit will still be stunned, so Icebreaker can kill that one too. This thing will just kill a unit every turn until it is silenced or dealt with if you have a deck that is built around it. That makes it a very strong pick in Standard. In Draft, you can make this work. You have to build around it, but Flash Freeze is a common, so if you are keeping an eye out, you will find enough stun effects. Dazes get past, last in almost every draft, but maybe you don't even want to pick those up. So yeah, keep an eye on how many stun effects you have, and then maybe consider picking Icebreaker in Draft. In Ranked, it's a good card for a control deck. And that archetype is not quite strong enough to be like top tier, but it's still pretty solid. Mirror Image, play a copy of one of your units. This also triggers any summon effects that the unit might have, like Ice Sprite's Stun or Lava Blood Goliath's Explosive Burst. So as a result, Mirror Image has some interesting plays in Standard. I think it's pretty mediocre in both instances, but if you have a good plan for it, it's okay. This card is usually just a good body and a good summon effect. But sometimes the risk of it is that if you're dealing with a lot of removal, you sometimes just won't have a creature to play, and then you can't Mirror Image, and that card is a dead card in your hand. And that's the real risk of Mirror Image. The recursion effect is quite strong. Nothing in Ranked that currently runs this, but there could be sometime soon. Polymorph, transform a unit into a 1/1 frog. This is a slow spell, and the 1/1 frog it leaves behind is, I think, still relevant. I don't like this card as removal, but it is a very total removal that silences the effect of a creature, and that means that it's okay in blue. I think it's a decent draft card to pick because it is removal. I think it's a decent Standard card to pick if you're dealing with a lot of threats and you need the right amount of removal. There are a lot of ways to get killed by frogs in Eternal. So if there is, for example, a Xenon Obelisk down, then the frog is like a 2/2 or a 3/3. This card is okay removal. It sees very little play in Standard, but it does see play in Standard because it is strong removal, and you need certain amounts of strong removal. Push Onward. Draw one of the top 3 cards of your deck and reduce its cost by 1, put the rest on the bottom. It sees play in quite a few decks, including Armory. Armory will splash blue for this card and Wisdom of the Elders. This card shuts down the board hard for 2 turns. It's more effective than Cloud of Ash in that particular respect. It kills a bunch of 1/1s. It does a ton of interesting things for card advantage. Pretty much anything that's trying to find a particular combo piece or search up a particular card is going to want Push Onward because it is a limited level tutor that also gives you a slightly cheaper effect. That cheapness is actually a pretty decent effect, and unlike Shamanic Trance, this card does not provide card disadvantage while it's doing that. That makes it relatively powerful. This card is quite good in Standard. I would almost never run it in Draft. It's just too slow, and it's not providing you any actual card advantage. But Scaly Ruin, 1/4. This is a pretty bad card. It's also kind of boring, which is always unfortunate. This card serves pretty well in Draft if you are trying to protect your board from a bunch of small creatures and also attack with flyers. And it also works in Pauper decks for exactly the same reason. It's a good defense against aggro that survives lightning storms, and it's just generally kind of hard to kill. It survives torches. It's got a decent array of stats for being a block that you just have to deal with, and is fairly hard to deal with. It's an okay budget card. That's about all it's good for. Sky Snapper, 3/1 flying. This card's great in Draft and bad in Standard. It's way too easy to remove. The offensive value of this card means that it provides a very early clock and is therefore quite aggressive. This thing dies to snowballs a lot, dies to lightning storms, dies to piercing shots, dies to everything. As a result, it doesn't see a lot of play in Standard, but it is a really good pick in Draft. Probably I wouldn't rate it as high as Teriak's Hatchling, which is the 2-1 with Echo for the same cost, but yeah, the clock on it is quite good if you don't deal with it, and you absolutely have to deal with it, and it's pretty likely to trade with another flyer. Thunderbird, Flying Aegis for 3. I haven't seen anyone run this card. I haven't really seen this card in Draft either, which is odd. The stats on it are pretty weak, but the Aegis effect is actually quite good. I think this must be a set 0 card or something, because I've never seen this in Draft. Or if I have, it's just kind of gone completely unnoticed. The Aegis effect is decently strong. You can run an equipment you can run a equipment deck that runs Thunderbird. Nobody's using it right now. You'll very rarely see it in either Draft or Standard, but I think it's okay. The stats on it are a little bit weak, but for the most part it's a decent flyer, and the Aegis effect is quite powerful. Aegis is just a generally powerful effect to have, and makes it quite good with a large array of interesting options. Yeah, could be used in Ranked. Wisdom of the Elders, draw 2 cards. Yeah, this card is great in Draft and Ranked, and you should definitely consider running it in almost every deck. This is good card advantage at a cheap price. If you're in blue, this is one of the reasons to be in blue. It just gets you 2 cards, and that alone just makes it worth it. The obvious disadvantage is that it slows you down, but if you're not doing anything on turn 3 anyways, you can just pass the turn, pretend that you have a combat trick up. At the end of your opponent's turn, you draw yourself 2 cards. There are a lot of different reasons why this card is really good, but the basic idea is that when you are picking in Draft, one of the first things that you're looking for is good parity, which is this card going to be worth as much as one of my opponent's cards? And the answer for Wisdom of the Elders is always yes, because this card is worth 2 cards, and your opponent's cards are usually always only worth 1. So yeah, Wisdom of the Elders is just the straight up best example of card advantage that there is in the game. It's a good way to sort of learn about card advantage and why it's good. If you don't really understand why card advantage is good, run with this card for a while and you will figure it out, because yeah, this is a card that has always been strong and probably always will be strong in pretty much any archetype. When you activate it, it allows you to draw 2 new cards from your deck. Okay. Avalanche Stalker. This is a 2/5 that has Ambush, and it also has double influence. Okay, so the double blue influence makes it a little bit restrictive, and as a result, it's not going to see that much play in Standard, because it's a neat surprise, but it's pretty expensively costed. The stats are fairly weak, and while the defensive stat is really good, there are a lot of cards that are going to figure out a way to get past this. In Draft, it's pretty strong. It's going to kill 2/3 on turn 4. It's attacking you. It's going to be just a constant thorn in your opponent's side that does the thing that Scaly Gruon is trying to do. So yeah, it's worth picking in Draft, and it's a pretty good pickup if you get it at Uncommon. Clifftop Rider, 2/3 with flying. I like this card less than Thunderbird. It's more expensive, and it's got slightly better stats, but still doesn't have that 3 attack that you're looking for. Definitely not a good card in Standard. You could pick it in Draft just because it's got flying. Cloudsnake Harrier, 3/3 flyer. Summon, you may put a card from your hand on top of your deck. Its cost is reduced by 2. So the nice thing about this card is that it is a May effect. You do not have to put the card from your hand on top of your deck. And as a result, Cloudsnake Harrier is actually a decently statted flyer. The 3/3 for 4, we've already seen a 3/3 for 5 in the form of Storm Dancer, and a 2/3 for 4 in the form of Clifftop Rider, so we can tell that that's a little bit better than all of the other flyers on the same curve, or like it's just pretty decent stats. The summon effect is actually pretty powerful. It incurs some card disadvantage, but it also has some good effects. Like, first off, it puts a card on top of your deck, which is very strong for anything with Echo. Secondly, it makes that card cheaper, which is also very strong for anything with Echo. Thirdly, it's just like that reduced cost is also pretty good on like really, really big cards that get you a lot of advantage, like Channel the Tempest. So if you're running like a Cloud Snake Harrier deck in like mono blue, you can get a Channel the Tempest on 6. And when we see Channel the Tempest at the end of this video, we will understand why that is a good thing. Cloud Snake Harrier sees a lot of play in Standard in Clockroach decks, because it turns out having 1/1 creatures that can be like 5/5s and 6/6, or 1-cost creatures that can be 5/5s and 6/6s with tons of different abilities is really, really good. And yeah, so this card is quite good with Crown of Possibilities and Clockroaches. It's very good in Standard. I would pick it in Draft for sure, because it is a decently statted flyer. Deranged Dinomancer, 1/1 at the start of your turn, transform a unit into a 5/5 Carnosaur. This card is too weak to see play in Standard. It's going to get killed as soon as it's played. This card is extremely strong in Draft because, yeah, it just makes everything into Carnosaurs. When you don't want to transform one of your opponent's units into a Carnosaur, you get to turn Deranged Dinomancer into a Carnosaur and fulfill all of his lifelong dreams. So as a result, Deranged Dinomancer is quite good. At the very least, it can end up being a 4-cost 5/5, and that's not too bad. But the other thing that can happen to it is you play it as a 4, your opponent kills it, and then, like, you didn't really lose out there, right? Like, he just, he had to waste a torch on it or something? That's still okay. Yeah, so Deranged Dinomancer is quite solid in Draft. It's currently not in Ranked for any reason, but the silencing and the transforming is all pretty fun. Maybe it could see some play. Frostkin, stun an enemy unit. This is a 3/3 body. That makes it very good in Draft and fairly bad in Standard. It's got enough meat on its bones to be pretty effective as a attacker and blocker. The stun effect is very powerful. It's a decently aggressive card. It doesn't provide real card advantage, but in the course of a short game, then it does, basically, because it's always disabling an enemy unit with its summon effect. The other option here at 4 is a 3/2 that exhausts an enemy unit, and that card has Warcry, and that's in red. So yeah, this is pretty comparable, and it's pretty tough. I would say it's definitely a medium to high pick in Draft. It doesn't really run in Standard, but if you were running a Icebreaker deck, then you would run this as well. Rain of Frogs. Choose a non-power card from the enemy player's hand, which is basically any card. Transform each copy of that card in their hand, deck, and void into 1/1 Frogs with Destiny. So this card is the card that you pick when you don't know what your opponent has to counter, but you know that you want to counter it. So it's very good against control archetypes that are trying to play like a very specific strategy. It's very good against combo decks for exactly the same reason. Against aggro decks, the frogs that it gives you are often going to kill you, and that's a little bit risky. I think the big thing about Rain of Frogs is that if you are playing a blue deck and you get targeted with Rain of Frogs, you should consider not playing the frog, because if you second sight the frog and put it on top of your deck, it gets Destiny and draws you a new card for free. And that's just one of the like weird things about Rain of Frogs, where essentially this card is giving your opponent 4 free frogs in his deck, and if the game runs long, he's just going to get some advantage out of that. But it shuts down any one particular card in your opponent's deck very, very hard. If you generate an Aegis, this is one of those reasons why you actually want to have Aegises. The effect is pretty strong. I like how this frog is sort of just like in the middle of Serpent Trainer's card thing. But yeah, 0-cost frogs are pretty good sometimes. Frogs with swords will often do what they are destined to do and kill your opponent, so you have to be a little cautious of this card and not run too many of them. I wouldn't run it in Draft. The frog disadvantage is just too much. There's almost nothing that you're going to want to counter that badly. Serpent Trainer, flying, infiltrate, play a 2/2 Serpent Hatchling with flying. Just strong enough for Standard if you're trying to play a lot of flyers. Works with Cloud Snake, Wild Cloud Snake very well, since both flyers trigger Wild Cloud Snake's ability. In Draft, this is a very strong card. It generates 2 2/2s for 4 cost. That's 4/4 in flying stats. That's more flying stats than you can generate with any other card. The strength of this card is just demonstrable in Draft. It doesn't see a lot of play in Standard because those 2/2s are just too easy to kill before they do something cool. Stormcaller, exhaust Stormcaller to deal 1 damage. There are a couple of weird things that you can do with this card. The 2 that I can think of are Beast Caller's Amulet, which is a 1/0 equipment that gives it infiltrate, play a 5/5 beast, Stormcaller deals 1 damage, it infiltrates, and it plays the 5/5 beast without ever having to deal with attacking or blocking. So that's one option. The other one is Venom Fang Dagger, which gives the card Deadly. Stormcaller deals 1 damage to any creature, it has Deadly, that creature dies. So those are the 2 combos with Stormcaller that are okay. Other than that, this card is okay at picking off 1/1s. It usually doesn't get a lot of value before it's torched, so it doesn't see a lot of play in Standard. It's really not that great in Draft, but it's still okay. It is always going to be doing that 1 damage and piercing through, like, picking off creatures that you'd rather not have on the board. Yeah, it's a mediocre pick in Draft. Maybe even a decently high-rated one. But you want the stats first, then you want the tricky card. Aerial Ace, 2/3 Flying Aegis. Yeah, this card is decently strong with equipment. It's got a decent amount of stats. It's very similar to Thunderbird, and you actually have to pay 2 more for the extra 1 toughness. So that's something that you have to consider. Aegis Flyers can be really, really strong. They're not strong in Standard at the moment, but people are trying now, and if that develops, we might see Aerial Ace. I don't think it's super likely. This card is an okay pick in Draft because it's fairly hard to kill and it puts your opponent on a tiny, tiny clock, but it's still not super high. Crystallize! Stun and deal 1 damage to each enemy unit. It's very, very powerful in Standard, and it was a card that you should probably pick up one of if you get a chance at it in Draft. The effect of this card is very, very good. It's strong in particular Elysian Midrange, which is a card that is currently at the top of the ladder, or a deck that's currently on the top of the ladder. Yeah, it's a good way to just beat down and finish off your opponent very, very quickly. The obvious risk is a lot of endurance creatures, but in general, I think this card is quite good. The 1 damage does count sometimes. It allows you to trade like your 5/6 into your opponent's 5/6, for example, and that's pretty relevant when you're playing a Duel of the Sandstorm Titans. Elysian Trailblazer, 3/3, the top spell of your deck gets Echo. There are some cool things that you can do with this card. The big target for Elysian Trailblazer is Channel the Tempest. You Echo a Channel the Tempest, then you have like all of the card advantage and damage that you could ever ask for in the world. The other thing that you can do with this is you can use Static Bolts with it. That's another good one, because if you draw a Static Bolt, the Fate effect triggers for both copies, and then both copies get the +2 bonus that the Static Bolts get. So instead of drawing a Static Bolt that deals 2 damage, you draw a Static Bolt that you draw 2 Static Bolts that deal 4 damage. And then later on, when you're like second sighting your Static Bolts, yeah, there are a lot of fun things you can do with that. This card has a lot of potential in Standard decks. The Echo effect is strong enough that it's actually quite good in Draft, because it gives you decent parity, because it always doubles up a spell, a relevant spell. Stats on it are not that great, but a 3/3 is still good enough. Yeah, it's worth picking in Draft, especially if you have spells. If you don't have spells, then it's not worth picking in Draft at all. Lots and lots of potential for this card. It's a really fun design. Jotun Hurler, 3/4, Fate Draw a Snowball. This card is crazy, crazy good. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It's a good Standard pick, and it's a good Draft pick. The Snowball is extremely relevant. It's a great anti-aggro card because it doesn't die to Torch, and it's a beefy body that you can play at turn 5 to, you know, just kind of stick in someone's way. But the free Snowball is what's really important. It usually gets rid of a threat that is just like something you really need to deal with very early on. In addition, it's another one of those cards that manages to spend half a card to pop an Aegis, which there are a couple of different options for blue to do this, and all of them are pretty relevant to what blue's strategy is. So yeah, Jotun Hurler, very, very strong card. Used in both formats, definitely pick it. Jotun Warrior, on the other hand, is not worth it. It's a 3/5. It's kind of an okay Draft pick because a 3/5 is hard to kill and really just gets in the way and deals a decent amount of damage. But it's pretty boring. It's not a Standard pick at all. And yeah, we'll just move on from this one. Magus of the Mist, 3/3 that plays a 6/6 flying illusionary dragon that dies if the Magus of the Mist dies. This can be an extremely powerful effect. I haven't seen a Magus of the Mist deck in a while because torches are pretty common, and that's like the big risk of Magus of the Mist, is that you get to a point where they're gonna torch you, and then you're just really, really sad about life, right? You play it down, and then they torch it, or they death strike it, and the dragon dies, and just everything is pain and sadness. But in general, this card is quite strong. It provides 9/9 worth of stats. If you unstable form the Magus of the Mist, then the illusionary dragon can't die because Magus of the Mist doesn't exist. So that's one of many options to cheat out the dragon. You can also silence the dragon. The dragon, I believe, is the card that actually has the ability dies if Magus of the Mist dies, so you have to silence the dragon and not the Magus. But if you silence the dragon, it becomes a 6/6 that's not flying, and also can't die if Magus of the Mist dies. So there's a couple of ways to cheat and keep that dragon, and keep those really good stats. That makes it a good card in Standard. I think it's a good card in Draft because, yeah, it's just boss. Like a 6/6 dragon for 5 is ridiculous, and there's not people are not going to be like super likely to kill it. If they do kill it, it's not too much trouble out of your day. Primal Incarnation, flying, 1 attack for each of your blue influence. I haven't seen this card in a while. It's good enough in Draft. It's a decently statted flyer. It's probably not good in Standard because Hybrid is so important in Standard, but if you are running mono blue, it's an okay way to finish out the game. I think there are more exciting options here, and Sapphire Dragon is one of them. As a 5/4 flying, Sapphire Dragon is a pretty good statted flyer that's very, very strong in Draft. It can even be played in Standard because a 5/4 dragon with flying is not bad at all. Not at 5 power. Like, this is just a really pretty efficiently statted creature. Soaring Stranger. Strangers have flying. Probably one of the most useful strangers for just like winning the game. It is a 3/3 flyer by itself. That makes it an okay draft card if you have strangers. Having a 3/3 flyer in general is just okay, so if you can pick it, it might be worth it. I haven't seen it in Standard for the same reason I haven't seen other strangers in Standard, but maybe someday. And yeah, it is probably one of the more worthwhile strangers to have. Staff of Stories. 0/5 relic weapon. At the start of your turn, draw a card. So if you take more than 5 damage, this card goes away. But if you don't take more than 5 damage on your turn, you draw an extra card. This card generates advantage very, very quickly. If you get your opponent into a stall situation and play this down, it is just a great way to win more. And that is like the sort of strength and weakness of Staff of Stories. It is a card that wins more. If you're playing a like really hard control deck where you just have to get to like that one particular card that is going to win you the game, Staff of Stories is amazing because you're just going to shut the board down completely, and then you're going to draw all of your cards and get a ton of advantage because you're not winning really just by controlling the board. Yeah, this card is quite good as a 1-of. It is probably not good as a 2-of or 3-of in most decks. Like, even the deck that is hard control only runs 1 of these. It is really obnoxious if it stays on the board. It is one of the best card engines in the game. Just generates a ton of advantage, forces your opponent into some bad attacks. There are a lot of good things about this card. A card that allows you to win more is not necessarily as strong as a card that can save you from losing. Westwind Herald, Flying Aegis, infiltrate, play a spell from the void for free. Oh, we're almost done. Okay, this card is okay in Draft. Yeah, it'd be okay in Draft. It gives you a decent amount of parity, and it's an okay statted creature. If you use it with Wisdom of the Elders or another cool spell, then it's pretty great. It has a place in Standard, but it's not very strong. It's just a little too easy to kill, even though it has Aegis. But nonetheless, it is played in some decks. And if you can figure out a way to get a really powerful spell into your void, you can cheat it out a little bit faster. Windshaper. Your flying units have +1/+1. This card is pretty strong in both Draft and Standard. It's a good body in Draft in particular. The flying bonus is quite strong in Standard. Yeah, this card is just a beater. And it's always going to do the thing that you want it to do, which is stall at the board on the bottom while your units fly over the top. It's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot to it. If you give it flying, it will give itself +1/+1. And if you give it anything else flying, that's always a good way to give it an extra stat boost as well. Doesn't see too much play in Standard, but it's still okay. Arachnodon, 4/5 Overwhelm. This creature is pretty bad in terms of stats. You can run it in Draft because it's just meaty enough, but it's probably one of your worst options. I don't see a place for it in Standard or in Ranked. Just don't run it. Celestial Omen. Draw a card of your choice from your deck. One of the only ways to like pick a particular card out of your deck, and it is costed appropriately. It's a fast spell, which means you can pick the card at the end of your turn, so if you act like you don't have anything to do on the end of your turn, and then you just draw the best card in your deck, that's pretty strong. You have to be careful how many of these that you run, since they do end up being dead cards in your hand sometimes, while you are slowly getting beaten down by fast cards, but in control matchups, this card is pretty tops. Hatchery Raider. What an interesting design. Transform all of the cards into your hand into 3/3 flying sky serpents that cost 2 apiece. This card is quite good in draft and is a pretty strong rare to pick because it gives you a lot of efficiently costed flyers and just turns a hand of bad cards into a hand of very good ones. I haven't seen a deck that runs this in standard, but you could work it. The flying effect is pretty strong. You play it with a bunch of Echo cards in particular, and you get a bunch of free flying serpents. That's just cool. Yeah. This card is just a neat design. It's not usually strong enough for standard, but of course there's a specific deck, and you want to try and run it. Joral Iceheart, 6/6, Infiltrate. Draw the top spell of your deck, deal damage to each enemy unit equal to that spell's cost. What a powerful Infiltrate effect. I have built a deck around this that tries to get only one spell in your deck, and it's an 8-cost spell, and that's just a one-sided wrath. In general, I think this card's Infiltrate is too strong. It's always going to be something that your opponent has to kill. The stats and influence cost make it a little bit unplayable in standard. It's really strong in draft, obviously, but it's not something you're going to get too commonly. It sees a little bit of play, but only by me. A 6/6 for 6 is just not quite good enough, and it is usually not going to get its Infiltrate. But if you can get its Infiltrate, it is just disgusting. Mistveiled Drake, 3/3 flying. Fate, you gain an Aegis, so you get the Aegis as soon as you draw this card. If you have an Aegis, Mistveiled Drake gets +3/+3. Here's a reason to run Island's Favor. This card is good in draft because it is usually a 6/6 flyer, and if it is not, it is still giving you some kind of value, and it's an okay flyer. This card is not used too much in standard, but I think that it's another strong sideboard option, where if you're just trying to deal with cards that are targeting your face a lot, Mistveiled Drake is always going to be giving you Aegises. It also just forces your opponent to waste a card to pop that Aegis so that you don't get that 6/6. Yeah, both of those effects are pretty good. This card has a really nice design, and in general it's going to be strong in both formats. Northwind Herald, flying, free if you have played 2 spells this turn. You're not going to get this out in draft for the cost that you want, usually, but if you do, then it's a pretty nice beating. And if you don't, then you still have a 3/2 flyer at 6. That's not the worst thing in the world. This card is okay in standard. It does get out really fast, but then it usually dies to Lightning Storm or something. So it's only reasonable. If you have unstable forms, this card becomes a lot better because you can make it be free, play it, wait until the next turn, then it's no longer free. You unstable form it and do a 7-cost card. If you're really lucky, you get K-Ball Infiltrator and steal your opponent's entire hand. If you're not, then you just turn it into an 8-cost, which is usually a Scion. Thunderstrike Dragon, 5/5 flying Echo. Yeah, absolutely pick that in draft. Are you kidding? It's 2 5/5s for the cost of 1. That's just brilliant. Yeah, and it sees a little bit of play in standard control because it provides you with a way to win the game and provides you with solid card advantage. If you're just constantly creating all of these 5/5 Thunderstrike Dragons, eventually you're going to beat them down. And there isn't a way that they can stop you from generating that many of those cards because you're always going to be doing it in your hand. That's tricky for your opponent to stop. The card is expensive, and that's its main drawback. It's very, very slow. But in terms of card advantage and overall stats for cost, this card has a lot of potential. Channel the Tempest. Draw 3 cards, then deal damage equal to the number of cards in your hand. At most, this card can do 12 damage. The 3 cards are always relevant. That is the biggest draw that you can get in the game outside of Dragon's Eye. And yeah, it's a real nasty piece of work. This is the finisher for a lot of control decks. People try to give this Echo, they try to excavate it, they try to do a lot of stuff to make sure that they hold on to this card and continue to play it. It's a good way right now to end out any combo in Standard. In Draft, it's worth picking up, I think. You're just going to finish the game out with it. Be a little careful because it does cost 4 blue influence, so you have to be sure that you're running enough blue. And if you're not, then you're not going to be able to play this card. It's incredibly good, and there's a lot of control matchups that are going to run this particular deck, particular card. It's one of the stronger cards in the game. Island, Queen of the Wilds. Whenever you play a blue influence spell, play an additional random blue influence spell from your deck. This is one of the Scions, so you get one of these for free. And her effect is very, very powerful, but you're not always going to be able to trigger it on your turn. You can always, like, Shamanic Trance or something, but on the turn you play it, it might not have its effect, and that makes it kind of weak for a Scion, because most of the Scions are just going to get death struck or murdered in some way as soon as they are played. Regardless, this is a 6/6 flyer. It's obviously a strong draft pick if you can get it. And yeah, playing the spells and getting the cards is a really fun endeavor that's worth trying. If you can figure out a way to make Island cheaper with Cloud Snake Carrier in particular, then there's a decent Island deck in there for you, because she does provide a ton of card advantage. Rhymescale Draconis. Flying, summon, play Permafrost on each exhausted enemy unit. We've already seen Permafrost, so we know how powerful an effect this can be. I have never seen anyone run Rhymescale Draconis in Standard, however I have seen a lot of people get blown out by it when the computer runs it in Gauntlet. It's quite a powerful effect. The 7/7 flyer has a very reasonable body. Once again, you're not going to see it in draft, but it's quite good there, of course. And yeah, in terms of Standard play, this hasn't found its niche yet, but it definitely has a place, probably as a counter card. Scourge of Frostholm, the only 10-cost card in the game apart from Skycrag Wyvark. 8/8, enemies can't play spells. This card will end the game for a lot of different players. If you are running up against a control deck and you play Scourge of Frostholm, they don't have a way to kill it. Camelus Control in particular just can't do a thing about this. You play it out and it's like, well, that's it. That's the game. You're done. So Scourge of Frostholm is pretty good in that respect. I actually should probably start running it just because Camelus Control is a thing that happens. Yeah, so this card has like some obvious counter potential. If you can cheat it out by resurrecting it from the grave with Grasping at Shadows, then it's a very powerful effect. The body is very, very reasonable. The thing that most often happens to it against time decks is it dies to Scorpion Wasp. But if you can stick it on the ground, it's one of the most powerful effects in the game, and it shuts your opponent down hard. The cost is prohibitive enough that it's not played very much in Standard. The cost is prohibitive enough that you probably couldn't even run it in Draft. It is just an incredibly powerful card effect, so worth trying. Skycrag Wyvark, 5/5, costs 2 less for each of your other flying units. This card is obviously quite alright. It's definitely a good draft pick if you've got flyers. If you don't, the cost is too prohibitive and you're not going to be able to play it. In Standard, it has sort of the same basic options, but I mean, you're almost never going to be able to play it because your opponents are going to be trying to keep your flyers to a bare minimum. They're going to be doing that regardless of whether or not they think you have a Skycrag Wyvark. So as a result, it doesn't see a lot of play in Standard. Yeah, so not the most exciting one to end the list out on, but Scourge of Frostholm is, of course, nonetheless filling that particular void. Alright, that's it for the blue cards. Thanks to like the people who are going to be like watching this on YouTube, because I will re-record this and everything. And like and subscribe, that would be helpful. Yeah, anyways, let's go ahead and play some more draft.